Thank you for joining us on Broadcasting Scotland. I'm Donald C. Stewart.
I'm Andrew Wilson, and welcome to our full Scottish special.
And in tonight's conversation, we have left perhaps the best till last. And I'm not just referring to my colleague and contributor, Andrew Wilson. Andrew, it's fantastic to see you once again tonight.
A good new year to you, Donald. It's great to see you too. How are you keeping?
I'm keeping very well. A good new year to Ian and all watching and indeed in the studio. It's fantastic to see you. And tonight, it is not the thorny issue, but the pressing issue of Scottish independence. We will be talking over the Supreme Court decision, Labour constitutional reform, which has been suggested down in Westminster, and potentially a de facto referendum that is coming our way due to the Scottish National Party's decision that if they cannot get a referendum by one mean, that they are going to go and attempt it by turning the Westminster election coming into a referendum. So, Andrew, let me begin with Scottish independence as a whole. We know it's been out there for decades. We know it has had traction for a particularly long period of time. We do know that some people would suggest that it was a referendum once in a lifetime. But perhaps what is less well known is that Margaret Thatcher described it as something that would only happen if the Scottish National Party returned a majority of Westminster MPs to Westminster. Well, we've not done it once, we've not done it twice, we've done it thrice. So, in terms of the independence movement and the independence campaign, what's its health check like now? How healthy is it?
Well, that's a very interesting question you asked, Donald, and one that could undoubtedly fill the next several days to discuss. But we'll try and truncate the conversation down a little bit than that. I think, from the perspective at the moment, and you mentioned the Supreme Court decision from November. I think from the perspective we're at right now, which is relatively close to that decision in November last year. I think the perspective is that the Yes movement, the independence movement in Scotland, is starting to turn its wheels again. It is starting the machinery is starting to move. The people are starting to turn their faces and their shoulders towards the task that's ahead. I'm not hugely surprised by that. I think culturally the notion of telling Scots that they can't have something usually means that that's the one thing that they will want. I'm reminded now we're just after the festive season that every time, or at least for 50% of the Scottish population, anytime a waiter puts down a plate on a table and says, "That's quite hot, don't touch it," the first thing they do is touch it. So I think in that sense the Supreme Court judgment has re-energised or has certainly put some more energy into it, has recharged the battery or refocused the energy of the independence movement. I think that's also because, in a sense, the judgment has cleared a little bit of the air. It has taken away one of the possible routes. The idea that that it was a possibility that the Scottish people could decide to have a referendum themselves and then have one. We've been told that we can't do that.
Radical.
Apparently. So that means it's no longer on the table, which means that the range of options is reduced, which means that our focus is increased on those remaining options. So I think in that sense, things are moving forward. I would say in my own experience, the Yes movement has, as we all have, the Yes movement has gone through a challenging and difficult 2 or 3 years during the pandemic. The traditional ways of campaigning were inhibited or were banned at one point for understandable public health reasons. I think people's focus and energy was to an extent diverted on to the day-to-day challenges that the pandemic brought. There was such a degree of uncertainty and such a degree of concern, understandably, both about people's health and their welfare and their incomes, that energy was focused. Energy was either taken away from the independence campaigning, or it was diverted to the immediate challenges and the concerns that people were facing. The pandemic is not over, but the restrictions that were laid upon us have now largely been removed, and so people are beginning to turn. As I say, people are beginning to turn their faces and turn their shoulders back to independence, and that is. And I think that we're seeing that in terms of the recognition across the movement, which had become, to an extent, fractious and a little bit factionalized. I think we're seeing those forces. I hope we're seeing, and I think we are seeing that aspect starting to drop away or to recede, and so we're going to see more collaboration. We're certainly seeing more in-person activism. We're going to see an online congress organised by Business for Scotland and Business Believe in Scotland. We're going to see an in-person conference organised by the Aberdeen Independence Movement a couple of weeks later, and then we have the SNP's Democracy Convention on the 19th of March this year, which will be an in-person event. So I think that the Yes movement is perhaps getting its teeth back into, or is getting its arms back around the challenge, and is starting to focus once more. So I think, and in my experience lately, I think we are seeing a movement. Well, there's two aspects. As was the case in 2014, the movement did not go away. We were not buried. We simply planted more seeds. And the resilience that the campaign has shown since 2014 was reflected in the resilience that the campaign has shown during the pandemic. And I would argue that perhaps the need for independence and the very tangible ways in which you can point to the benefits that independence would bring were amplified by the pandemic. The very different, despite being in a union of nations, the different approaches that politicians north and south of the border took to the pandemic demonstrated that there is a different way to do things than the way in which Westminster decides to do things, especially in a pandemic. And so I think those two things together, the pandemic and the ending of the pandemic, are now encouraging me to think that we're seeing a Yes movement that's about to flower, to come back to life properly, and that we're going to see some pretty effective and some pretty successful campaigning over the next 12 months.
I suppose it's interesting that you refer to the Yes movement, which those who are not overly involved in politics, let's call them the undecided, that often media portrayal is of the independence movement being one party and one woman. And then you get the memes, doesn't speak for me and all the rest, and it becomes quite untidy, and it becomes quite difficult to get through. And I suppose that part of the campaigning and the structure of that campaigning is to recognise that the people you need to convince in order to back independence are unionists, or those who have backed unionist parties in the past, those who are undecided because they haven't been convinced yet. And the factionalism of any movement, whether it be for something or against something, can often be the biggest barrier to convincing those people.
It absolutely can be, I think, not simultaneously, but it can be the biggest strength, but also the biggest problem, the biggest weakness. Factionalism that works, that manifests itself in I will represent this particular perspective on independence for Scotland. If there is respect between those various groups or parties or factions, then that I think has the prospect to attract those who are undecided, or who have been unionists in the past and are now so scunnered by what unionism means, that for example, the green perspective on independence that the Scottish Greens bring, the slightly less progressive politics that perhaps the Alba Party brings to the independence movement, and then the progressive politics that the SNP represents, and the more strongly socialist perspective that the SSP brings, thinking of all those parties which are support independence. So long as those parties are working, are collaborating with the purpose for which in many cases they were created, is to achieve independence, then I think it can be a strength. But we need to be careful because, as we know with politics, progressive politics generally, it very quickly factionalizes. If people don't like absolutely everything about something, then they will go off and set up another thing, and it very quickly can disappear into the sand as it becomes a smaller and smaller. So I think there are definitely challenges, and of course the biggest challenge that the independence movement faces and continues to face is a unionist opposition which is very well funded, which represents the establishment both in Scotland and in the UK more broadly. Excuse me. One which is supported almost entirely by the press, both print and visual or digital, and so the challenges that the independence movement faces continue to be considerable, but that, in my experience, that has never caused the independence movement to do anything other than rise to the challenge.
Has, I mean, the breadth of that, having mentioned those parties, and there are various other individuals who have literally put their shoulders to the collective wheel, who have gone on into other careers and are always there somewhere or thereabouts in terms of supporting it. Did the Scottish Government's referral to the Supreme Court, was that a masterstroke?
I think it's probably too soon to say if it was a masterstroke. Mm-hmm. I think it was sensible. I think it was productive and sensible, well thought out politics, and I think it was sensible and well thought out use of the legal system. I know that from sections of the Yes movement, the policy and the implementation of that policy have been criticised robustly, and criticism, so long as it's done with the best of intentions, is always to be welcomed. If it's criticism that is intended to improve rather than destroy, that serves a constructive purpose. So I think, insofar as if what I was saying, if I accept what I was saying a moment ago, which was that one of the results of the Supreme Court decision is that the Yes movement has been re-energised for reasons that relate that to use a phrase that you've used, that are in the DNA of Scottish voters and Scottish people who've been told that they can't have something, so that's what they're going to have now. I think that in that sense, it was an appropriate move, because in a sense it was a win-win in the event that the Supreme Court said, yes, of course you can have a referendum. Why would you not have a referendum? We live in a socially democratic society. We have a referendum. Mm-hmm. If we don't have if we're told that we can't have a referendum, then a number of people who are Democrats, who are motivated by democracy fundamentally, and who may either have been agnostic about independence or were soft-nosed, they're Scots as well, and they're now being told that they can't have their say. So I think, in that sense, it did clear the air. It did crystallise the positions to a greater extent, and I think in broader terms that is important in terms of the campaigning generally, because we know from experience of 100 years of other countries which have been subject to rule from Westminster, one of the things that Westminster will do is to continue to move the goalposts until such time as that country becomes independent. So if we can start to narrow the pitch, so there's less room to move the goalposts back and forth, then in broad terms that's a good thing.
I think, yes, the idea of Westminster ruling Scotland is something that has suddenly become something. I think that for many people, it was a pejorative idea that people were kind of responding to. Well, we're not really, we elect and we're part of a bigger thing. And, you know, I remember Alistair Carmichael on with Nicola Sturgeon, and Alistair and I shared a flat for many years as students. And we had exactly the same argument, because I was not in the SNP at the time. I was of another political persuasion. Mm-hmm. And the two of us were having the debate about devolution.
Yep.
And my jaw dropped during it, because I could see Alistair using the very words and the very argument I used 20, 30 years ago, and thought, it's bizarre how we've changed and switched. So the idea of being ruled suddenly, like a flick of a switch, because of, and I'll use the analogy of the switch in a minute, the big red button, don't touch it. It brings, surely, the idea of it closer that when we do have any election, it will no longer mean Douglas Ross to mention it 14 times in the debate before it becomes something that's present in everybody's mind.
I think that's absolutely right, and I think I think there's the prospect, I don't know, but I think there's the prospect that it may change the style of campaigning on the campaign from the SNP, insofar as you say, the part of the campaigning, both for elections and for independence, is to talk about how the lives of everyone in Scotland will be improved by taking responsibility for our own affairs. And so, as you say, it was more often than not that the Unionists were banging on about independence, whereas the SNP and other pro-independence parties were talking about the benefits of it rather than about it as a totem, as an isolated thing.
You could almost imagine that Douglas Ross was obsessed by it.
I try very hard not to put myself in the mind of Douglas Ross if I can possibly help it. It's so I'll dodge that thought. But yes, absolutely. So I think it will likely change the nature of the campaigning, because the nature of the election will be changed. And I think again, insofar, I'm not going to stretch the crystallised metaphor too far, but I think, to quote Pat Kane, in terms of the 20% of the Scottish electorate who need to quietly and sincerely ask themselves what sort of country is it that they want to live in, I think there's a chance, I think there's better than a chance, that a significant chunk of that 20% will think, I would like to live in a democracy. And apparently I am not currently. So I think I think it will have an effect, and I think the extent to which the Supreme Court went further than it had to do in terms of talking about the rubbing our noses in it is possibly too strong a word, but insofar as the court in its decision spoke about the fact that we are in a democracy, that apparently we have the trappings of a democracy, but of course the reality is that it doesn't matter how we vote in Scotland, we will always be outvoted by the larger nation to the south, where we were told were partners but are clearly not, and so the High Court underlining that, I think, whilst people might have thought that was the Supreme Court, trying to make a point and trying to deflate the argument, I think potentially it has probably underlined the argument 2 or 3 times and put it into bold so everybody can see it.
And whilst we in Scotland are dealing with the being told like a naughty child not to do what we want to do, we have, of course, the Labour Party through their constitutional, I don't know whether it was there ever such a thing as a constitutional convention? Is that
there was, but I think Labour participated. Did they? In it? Yes, they will have done.
Well, they seem
some of Labour did.
They seem to handed it to a former Prime Minister to come up with some idea as to how to reform the House of Lords, which seems to be more important than much else. And I'm reading today, I don't know if it's true or not, it might not be true at all, or reading over the last week, that the Speaker of the House of Commons has suggested that he would be against an elected second chamber.
He gave an interview just before Christmas saying that in terms.
Yes, Lindsay Hoyle.
Sir Lindsay Hoyle.
Indeed. Of course, Sir Lindsay. They seem to elevate themselves on a regular basis. It seems to be quite an interesting obsession. You've got the Conservative Party under Douglas Ross, who I referred to 14 times in one debate. I think it was 16 times in another one, and kept on going about how everybody else is obsessed by it. And then you've got the Labour Party, who, in terms of their own response to constitutional affairs, seems to be that bit down there needs sorted. So it seems strange that the Labour Party wouldn't grasp a thistle.
It does seem strange given the talk that we hear from the Labour Party, but I think the reality of the situation is that we see the words Labour constitutional reform written down many, many more times than we ever actually see any Labour constitutional reform. I think we saw promises of reform from Gordon Brown in 2014, none of which have manifested themselves. We've seen the Labour Party promising to reform the House of Lords for more than a century, and it's never happened effectively. And I think that, and that, in my mind, plays a little bit to the challenge that the two-party state in the current UK constitutional setup brings. I was a Labour voter when I was a younger man. And I was a supporter of the reforms that, at the beginning of the Blair government, were brought in, which reduced materially the levels of child poverty in the UK. And I would regard those as being an example of some of the good that Gordon Brown did. However, those reforms and the changes were introduced in such a way as they were not structural. And all it took was a change of government, and the situation reversed, and if anything, it has become worse. And so the abject failure of the Labour Party to reform pretty much anything in a constructive and permanent way is one of my objections to Gordon Brown's participation every time he's jump started and brought out from whichever darkened room he's kept in to start telling the Scots what they can and can't have. Because you can be sure that whatever it is that he puts in his constitutional proposals, that's what we will not get. If history teaches us anything.
It's an interesting thing in terms of the Labour Party, because if I'm wrong, I apologise, but I do believe that the only reform in the House of Lords was brought in by a Conservative government. It's a Conservative government that's had three female Prime Ministers, and one from an ethnic minority at one point. Yep. Under Liz Truss, every single major office was held by somebody who was not white, male and middle-aged.
Yep.
And yet, it's interesting that you bring the point in terms of it wasn't structural change. Structural change, even within the Labour Party, appears to be a struggle for the Labour Party, never mind when they're in some form of power in government. They seem to be able to remove clauses from their constitution, but they don't necessarily seem to be able to do the job of the oxymoronic, if I may use that term, Labour constitutional reform. But what it does is give us that platform that we now move towards. A couple of nights ago, I asked you the unfair question of, did you think that Rishi Sunak would be Prime Minister this time next year? And your answer, if I can remind you, was no. Mm-hmm. If the answer is no, that means that there's a possibility that he will have gone either by coup in the Conservative Party, not that they're used to that kind of behaviour.
No, never.
Or that he has been voted out. If he's been voted out, then in the next 12 months, will we de facto get that referendum?
I do think so. I think that we were lectured when the Supreme Court made its decision, and the First Minister and other SNP politicians underlined the message that they had set, that they had already stood up, that as a result the next step for us was in a sense a reflection of what you said at the beginning of this programme, that Mrs Thatcher pointed out, that all Scotland needed to do was send a majority of independents supporting MPs to Westminster, and Scotland would have her independence. Now, we've been there for a while now, so in a sense we've had a number of de facto referendums from that Mrs Thatcher perspective. And so that we then again sweep any doubt off the table and focus on one, crystallise it again, and make it a very clear and singular choice. I think in that sense that we will. I know that the current SNP leadership are criticised from time to time for the way in which they have framed campaigns. There are a number of people who continue to criticise the last two general election campaigns, which were round about Stop Brexit. But I happen to think that campaign probably was the right one in a not necessarily in terms of that individual election, but in terms of a sweep of elections. That I think history is already showing us that was the right thing to be saying and the right thing to be campaigning on. But putting that to one side, I think an absolute laser focus on independence, and both the preparation for a de facto referendum at the next election, be it a Scottish election or a UK general election, and the preparation, and also the excuse me, the necessity of planning that, the necessity which will derive from planning that, which is planning and describing what comes next after a successful de facto referendum. I think that will energise the debate, it will energise campaigners, and I think it's very much the type of conversation that we need to be having at the moment. Again, back to Pat Kane's point about asking 20% of the Scottish electorate who haven't made their minds up yet what sort of country they want to live in.
I think that, yeah, what happens, I suppose, is the next question, that if we do get a referendum, do we return 55 SNP MPs? Do we return 40? Do we return 30? At what point does the Unionist Party of choice, whichever it may be, the Unionists will vote for? Because I can't see in any way that Douglas Ross's overtures to Anas Sarwar are going to end up with them combining together to field one candidate in every single. I know. I do apologise to everybody as to what I have put in your heads, but the idea that they're going to join that as a referendum by saying we'll put one person up against your one person and we'll treat it like a referendum. Obviously, Sarwar is too cute for that. Douglas. However, what happens? We are up against a number of people, and we know in Eastern Bartonshire, the constituency I'm in, we're already getting heavy campaigning from the Liberal Democrats. We're the only ones that can stop the SNP.
Is that the ghost of Joe Swinson? Is this what you're saying?
Well, we now have a new ghost who, yes, indeed, the one who couldn't heed David Steele's warning of don't ever say that again. But, you know, maybe she could end up being her and Liz Truss could form a grouping. The idea that they're going to band together to make it that. But we know that in every single constituency, one candidate is going to say to the electorate, forget the Labour Party or forget the Conservative, forget the Lib Dem. I'm the only one who represents the party who was 200 votes behind her or 3,000. If you want to stop this, it's going to be me. Is that a tactic they should pursue? Because if they do and they lose, they've really lost.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. And I'm sure there are psephologists and number crunchers. I hope there are psephologists and number crunchers working on those scenarios at the moment, and I think there will be. Your point is absolutely right, although I think in the politics of an election, if in the circumstances, and I'm going to live in a constituency that's in the same situation as yourself, I think in those circumstances, it then is very easy for the independence candidate in that seat to stand up and say, well, in this seat it's a red Tory, in that seat it's a blue Tory. Is there a difference here or not? And I don't think that will sit particularly well with a proportion of the supporters of blue Tories and red Tories who will feel that they are being shortchanged or they're being misled. So I think there will be and that's on the hypothesis that they have been able to come to a reasonable conclusion. I know that there are challenges in some constituencies of paper candidates being put up and not campaigning, and I know that in Edinburgh, where I'm living at the moment, there is clearly an agreement between the Lib Dems that they do not stand a real candidate in Edinburgh South, and in return, the Labour Party agree they will not stand a proper candidate in Edinburgh West. We know that, we can see that. And so there is that prospect. However, I think in the context of a clear and straightforward offer being put forward in a manifesto by the SNP, I think that will flush out, and I hope that flushes out a number of undecideds who then have to decide: are we Democrats or are we not?
They will feel manipulated, no doubt, because rather than having an honest, straight choice, what they're being offered is a perverse choice which joins in with something but says it's not joining in, and it's that surely through that dishonesty, because the electorate, you can argue that the electorate, for example, in America was fooled when Trump became president. There are times when it's been fooled over here, I'm not quite sure when. But
2016 might be an argument, but yes.
So therefore, surely this time round, they're going to see through that, because there's not a vow left that is going to convince you.
Well, I think that's right. I think we saw. I think we could argue that as a result of 2014, we had one of the most politically engaged electorates anywhere in Western Europe, if not the Western world. And I don't think that's gone away.
Although many would suggest it was a politically divisive.
No, I don't believe that politics ultimately is divisive insofar as it is it's the only way we've got of operating a democracy at the moment. If someone can come up with a better plan, then that's happy to listen to it. The making sure that people are given a voice and a vote and can make their voice and their vote heard is fairly fundamental. So if that becomes divisive, then that's something for politicians to reflect on. But it is the system that we have. So I think in that sense, it presents a number of challenges for the Unionist forces. Not least that I think it would shine a light on the way in which Westminster politics does not play in Scotland anymore. Our Scottish politics are different, and that is at least in part a reflection of the fact that the wishes and the demands of the Scottish electorate are different. And so I think taking that approach, if the Unionist forces were minded to seek to band together and cooperate in that sense, I think it would underline again to the Scottish electorate that in fact they were being had. It didn't really matter who they voted for in the Unionist forces. There is no distinction between them in a sense, which doesn't come as a surprise to some of us. But I think to others who have been committed to, be it Conservative Labour or Lib Dem, that in fact there is as somebody had said to me last week, you can't get a bus ticket between them.
There's always been that value, hasn't there been? You mentioned earlier on about how Thatcher changed certain aspects of politics in the UK. A consensus was lost.
Yes.
And there was consensus, I think it was 1960 something, where the Labour or the Tory shadow chancellor stood up and just could argue about the budget because they agreed in so much. There was something about that consensus that was seen as a great positive, which is understandable. A strong opposition is what you need. And it could be argued that with Sarwar and Holyrood there is the development of that, whereas there's not been something like that for some time. Wouldn't it be wonderful if it was an independent Scottish Parliament? It would be much better. But structurally, the ideals that come across from the consensus of Westminster being the sovereign parliament within these islands seems to not just be crumbling, but seem to be disappearing before our eyes. So I suppose the one question that I've got for you is, if I can steal something from the past, are you suggesting that we will be free in 23?
Well, your point is a very good question, Donald. The point about sovereignty is in one sense, it's an abstract thing. People don't get up in the morning and wonder, who's sovereign today? I don't know. I'm sure there's bound to be a household somewhere in the country where it happens, but there can't be very many. And so the notion of who is sovereign, is it Westminster in terms of English legal practice, or is it the people in terms of the settled legal practice of Scotland? It's the people who are sovereign. It's certainly since 1314, and no matter what the Supreme Court has said this time, I don't believe that has changed. I think the way in which the debate is now going, I think we may struggle to be free in 23, but I'm prepared to campaign and prepared to nail my colours to the mast that we'll be out the door in 24.
Well, with that very singular thought, we have come to the end today, and thank you very much once again, Andrew, for joining me here today.
Donald, it's been a pleasure. It's been great talking to you this evening.
It's been fantastic, and thank you all. Well, that is it for this evening. But before we go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So, to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We have launched our new crowdfunder with a target of £30,000 to enable us to pay our bills and continue to make programmes. So please donate whatever you can afford. We can only continue with the support of our viewers. Good night, and thank you for watching. Bye for now.